So I've changed up the subject for this morning's. I was going to talk about something related to sales, but I'm not going to, because something's come up in the last week that I think is much more important. Jay and I have been talking about it, Casey and I have been chatting about it, and it's something that's little known and really doesn't come up much, but now that Ribbon and Knock are involved much more, this is going to come up, and I think it's important that we all know exactly what it is. And so everybody is familiar, probably, with FHA's flip rule. The flip rule meaning that if the title changes on a property, that FHA will not will not issue a loan. In FHA, you have to do something. The lender has to order a case number. So you order the case number after the contract is written. So on a flip, the contract has to be dated on day 91 after the title changed. So if I bought a property today and I wanted to sell it tomorrow, I could do that as long as the buyer were conventional or VA, but not FHA, because FHA says, I just bought the property, I'm trying to sell it immediately, I'm going to flip the property. I have to wait 91 days before I can sell that property to somebody wanting to get an FHA loan. That's pretty well known. Now, the thing is, you can't close on day 91. That's the day the contract has to be written, and that's the day that the lender orders the case number on day 91. Once the lender orders the case number, the lender can then send out the disclosures and go ahead and order the appraisal. So by the time you get to day 91, a good lender is already going to have the buyer, if they know they're buying this house, they'll probably already have them maybe all the way through underwriting, even though the loan has not even been yet disclosed. So that on day 91, all they've got left to do is get the contract, send out the disclosures, order the appraisal, and then submit everything one last time for clear to close once the appraisal comes in a week or two. And then you can close. That's pretty common knowledge. What is not known is something called an identity of interest. And I'm not going to go through all the definition, but FHA says that if there's an interested party in the transaction, that's why they call it identity of interest. If there's an interested party in the transaction, rules change for who can pay closing costs, how much they can pay in closing costs, who can offer money for down payment, blah, blah, blah. Well, here's an interesting rule that most people don't ever see, hear of, but we need to be aware of it, because it's very easy for a mistake to be made. In the case of Ribbon or Knock, somebody that's buying the property for the buyer. So you write a contract, and the contract says, that Ribbon is actually going to be the cash buyer. And you and I know that the buyer is going to be getting an FHA loan. And for some reason, that property does not close. The lender can't get the loan done, so Ribbon or Knock purchase the property. Well, when that happens, Ribbon and Knock have a clause in their agreement that says that they can move into the property and they'll just simply pay Ribbon or Knock rent. They're going to pay them rent until day 91, when they can then execute a new contract, go ahead and do that. And the rule is no, because the flip rule is then overcome or takes second priority to this what's called identity of interest. If that buyer moves into the house, it now creates a tenant-landlord relationship with Ribbon or with Knock or whoever. The fact that there is a tenant-landlord relationship now states, and it's at the very bottom, it's the last bullet point in the FHA guidelines, but it says that a tenant-landlord relationship is not exempt from the identity of interest. Identity of interest says that you can buy the property at the normal 3.5% down at day 181. Not 91, 181. You got to wait 6 months. Or you could buy the property on day 91 after the flip rule, but it requires a 15% down payment. Well, let's face it, many FHA buyers are not in position to put 15% down, so they'd have to wait to day 181. Well, obviously, Ribbon has recently caught this, because I've been looking at Ribbon contracts for some period of time now, and only last week did it finally come up in their questions about the identity of interest. So they must have got burned at some point recently, caught it, and now put it into their questions to the lenders. But here's where it gets real. First of all, any questions on that? Does that make sense to everybody? I mean, I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you. Flip rule says 91 days. Identity of interest says 181 days. If there's a tenant-landlord relationship, and there is if they move into the property.
So with the Ribbon, you restart your days, correct?
When Ribbon purchases the property, yes.
All right, so.
Because it's when the title changes. All right?
So
Now,
closing day one?
What's that?
Is closing day one of 180, or when do they start counting?
well, you start counting on the day that Ribbon buys the property.
So closing day.
Right. And then if they move into the property, now you create the tenant-landlord relationship, which now means we have to wait till day 181 before we can close. Okay, makes sense? Now there are a couple exceptions to that. Now, I'm using the idea of Ribbon and Knock because they do a lot of this. But say I'm selling the property to my son. Well, then the 181, and my son's renting from me, that identity of interest doesn't apply. So family gets around it, okay? But in our case, we're not dealing with family much, we're dealing with Ribbon and Knock, and that's why we have to be concerned with this. Now, here's a discussion Casey and I had this past week and how we, real estate and mortgage people, have to be very careful. What's happened with interest rates in the last 4.5 months? They've gone from 3 to 5, 3.5 to 5.5 or 6. So think about that. If I have to wait 181 days, what could, God forbid, but what could happen? Interest rates went to a point the buyer can't qualify. And they've moved into the house. Now, why would you tell me this? Why would somebody write a contract with Ribbon and the loan not go through? Why would that happen?
Repairs for the house required by FHA.
Okay, so flip rule, that's the number one. Why else might it not close? Besides the flip rule.
A mandatory clause.
What's that?
The mandatory clause?
The mandatory clause? It didn't come in. The only thing is that Ribbon does give you a coverage on that, so you're pretty safe on that side of it.
I don't mean the flip rule. I mean that the repairs, like if during the appraisal repairs are required, the seller is unmotivated to make the repairs, then that deal's not going to close.
So Ribbon buys it, and then you move in, and now you got an identity of interest issue. So there's multiple things that can happen in the contract during the time that you've written a contract with Ribbon, and now all of a sudden it's not going to go. And Ribbon is now buying the property. And your buyer, who really does not even have an inventory clause because we haven't supplied the exhibit because they're paying cash for the property. So now what happens? Now the buyer, Ribbon buys the property, buyer moves in, we got to wait 181 days before we can do a loan, and interest rates go up. This is ridiculous. It's gone up 300 basis points in the last 5 months. But let's just look at what if it went up 150 basis points? What if it went from 5.5 to 7? God forbid. But if it did, many of our FHA buyers probably would not qualify. So I bring this up, first of all, to point out this whole thing about identity of interest. Again, you don't have to remember all of this, but you're the trusted advisor to the client. And the more knowledge you have of something that could be a potential problem, the more you look like that trusted advisor. You know, all you have to say to the buyer is, hey, look, there's an issue with FHA and Ribbon, and why don't we get Greg on the phone and let him explain what we're up against before you take this action? Because it could potentially be an issue. Well, you're their trusted advisor. You don't have to know all the details as I'm pointing them out. You just have to know there's a flip rule, there's an identity of interest rule. One of those could cause a problem. So let's get Greg on the phone and talk about it, or whoever else you might want to talk to, but get them on the phone. That makes you look trusted. It makes you look like you're truly an advisor. It makes you look like you have more information than every other real estate agent that's out there that's just, oh yeah, let's go do this. And trust me, there's so many agents out there that are like that. Oh my gosh. I received a call on Saturday from an agent. This is not from this office thing, wouldn't happen. I get a call on Saturday from an agent. And I don't know if this agent's been in the business for a week or 10 years. I don't know, but I can tell you the questions. She's asking me questions about the real estate contract. I'm not talking about filling in the mandatory clause stuff that's happens all the time. I'm talking about, she's asking me questions about the contract. And I finally said to her, I said, okay, you realize I'm not a real estate broker. I mean, I can give you my interpretation, but I said, you need to call your broker. She's, asking questions like, what happens if I don't put an attorney in there? I said, and I asked her, why wouldn't you want to put an attorney in there? She said, well, I think maybe we want to let the seller pick it. I said, why is that? Well, isn't that the way they normally do it? And I'm like, oh my gosh. And she says, how many days do I put in for due diligence? I'm like, wait a minute, you're asking me? How many days for, now I'll get a question from some of you sometimes, how many days for due diligence? If you're gonna do zero financing, zero appraisal, Greg, how many days you need for due diligence? I'll usually tell you 7 or 8 days so we can get it in time. That's a legitimate question. She's asking questions that are like, wait a minute, Watson. So I tell you this because the more information you have about things that I can promise you most agents don't know anything about. If you use the term identity of interest, just test it sometime. Even with people in this office, just ask them. Have you heard of identity of interest? Where does that come from? I promise you, most people aren't going to have a clue what you're talking about.
I didn't know anything about it until I started working with Ribbon.
Yeah, that's when it starts popping up. And it's been around a long time. Yeah. Don't misunderstand me. But that last, when you start working with Ribbon and Knock, that's when it starts showing up because now it creates an issue, blah, blah, blah. So I'm just trying to give you enough information so that you're the most informed real estate agents on the planet, especially above everybody else. And you can advise your clients, be careful. Please let's don't write contracts that are going to put you in a situation that you later can't take advantage of and end up losing your money. And you think, Greg, that just doesn't really happen. I have a lady on her third offer right now. Now she's buying a small property, $100,000. She's on her third contract. It came in last night. Third contract. First contract, she lost her earnest money of $1,500.
Whoa.
She lost her earnest money. And you know how that happened? Because the buyer's agent didn't submit the termination before midnight. And I even asked the agent. I didn't say anything to the buyer because I'm not trying to get in between it, but I even asked the buyer. I asked the agent, I said, why? She says, well, it was late. So I thought I could send it in the morning. I'm like, seriously? That's the kind of thing that goes on out there. You don't see it because you're in this office, which has more training than any office I've ever been a part of. And that's a blessing for all of you. But the point is, are you using that information? Are you taking the information from this huddle and the huddle that Jay does and the huddle that Dwayne does and other huddle? Are you taking information and using it? Because you are, in fact, the trusted advisors.
That was a similar situation with me. I had my client on the seller side. and the buyer didn't turn in the termination, but then my seller got $10,000 in earnest money.
Exactly. You don't think it happens, but it does. I'm amazed at that. So the whole idea about being careful with your contracts, you know, Dwayne will answer the call, Jay will answer the call, Mike might even answer the call. I'm teasing. But the thing is, what I'm pointing out is you've got resources. You can call me and ask me things that, and it doesn't have to be related to a mortgage that I'm doing for one of your clients. I mean, already this morning, it's Monday morning, what is it, 10:18 or 11:18. I've had 2 calls from agents, not from this office, but I've had 2 calls from agents. They got contracts in over the weekend. They're listing agents, they're not the buyers, and they got questions about the contract because they're not sure of a couple things in the way that their pre-approval letter came in, blah, blah, blah. And they called me to ask me some questions about it. I love that. That means they trust me, they trust the information I'm giving them, and I would encourage you to do the same thing. That's what I'm saying. Call Dwayne, call Jay, call Mike, call me. If it's contract issue, call them. If it has something to do with the loan or potentially, even if it's your listing, pick up the phone and call me. Just ask. If I don't know the answer, I'll tell you I don't know. But I don't want you to lose out on a buyer, for a seller, or on something as technical that could potentially hurt your client as identity of interest. All right? Any questions on that? All right. Is no huddle next week, Monday, because it's going to be Memorial Day, and I hope that everybody's out having a big party. And the following week, we will have, and hopefully on that Monday, I'll go through what I was going to go through today on this one little sales technique that will probably, hopefully help you win one more contract or 2. Anything else? All right, thanks.